that the US and the UK spent over $1 trillion on a 20-year conflict to try to prevent it, has preceded border skirmishes with Pakistan, a country that's recently ousted its leader. So what next? And what threat to the UK? Well, let's talk first to our studio guest, Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, I understand that Prevent, the organisation set up to try and prevent terrorism, is due to come under an overhaul. Do you think that we are doing enough to prevent terrorism? Is it a topic that, because it's dropped out of news headline, risks surprising us all again?
Well, I'm afraid it exists. We saw, of course, just with the Sir David Amos murder case, that it exists, it's on our streets, it's happening. And there are numerous plots being foiled on a weekly basis. That much is evident. I think, though, what has certainly slipped off, people are looking at the international scene, forgetting there are domestic challenges, and there certainly is a dramatic reluctance to look at the issue of Islamist terrorism as opposed to, say, far-right terrorism, which has, of course, been on the increase. That bit is very easy to talk about. Everyone's quite happy talking about that. But the stuff with the ISIS Beatles and such like, and contemporary equivalents, that appears to many politicians a much more difficult proposition to tackle.
Do you think it's the fact that because we have actually had the Sir David Amos stabbing, but we haven't had a big mass terrorist event now for over a decade, that we might be getting a bit complacent? And yet we've had a report out this week about how much radicalisation is going on in our prisons, something that Dominic Raab has pledged that he is going to tackle. Do you think that there is a risk that unless something big happens, people do get complacent, from local authorities to police forces to everyday citizens who should perhaps be keeping a closer eye when they see suspicious goings-on?
Well, very much so. I think, no one wants terrorist attacks. Remember the last few that actually occurred. The big ones were in 2017, the Manchester bombing, the London Bridge attacks. But, that seems a lifetime away. We've had COVID since then, people were locked. And I think the COVID issue also kept things subdued because, of course, people were not on the streets. People were kept at home. And you didn't see this happening quite the same way. Of course, the danger is that having taken our eye off the ball and gone, well, this seems not to be a problem anymore, people who were radicalised during COVID at home by watching social media, by actually getting, bad ideas, are now able to circulate and plan attacks. And there is a fear now, I think, that there is going to be a new spate of attacks driven by those who were radicalised over the last 2-3 years, who may lead into another attempt. The mode will be very different to what we saw beforehand, because you don't have a terrorist organisation like ISIS able right now to do spectaculars, but you will get attacks. What
is the significance of Afghanistan now being controlled by the Taliban? A huge amount of resources were put into trying to stop that from happening. But could it be argued that, in a sense, this puts a plug in international terrorism? It's understood that the Taliban and ISIS don't often see eye to eye, and that might actually reduce the idea of reprisals in foreign countries because we're no longer putting troops on the ground in places like Afghanistan.
Oh, if only that were really true, Alex, in the sense that if only what the jihadists told us was really what was going on. If you look at the history of, say, jihadist terrorism for the past 2-3 decades, the course has changed. Basically, it's changed because the cause is not about Western intervention in foreign countries. It's not about Western troops on the ground here, there and everywhere. What it's actually about is about an ideology within a religion, a section of a religion, which has very aggressive and very outdated views, which wishes to impose that upon everyone else. And so the mistake is always to think that it's about us. It's not about us. It's about them. It's about what they actually want. Now, they tailor it to go, oh, it's Syria this year, Afghanistan next year. Back in the 90s, it was Bosnia, it was Kosovo. But there will be a new excuse next year, the year after, and so on, until, they get their way. So the problem is it's an ideological issue, not a foreign policy issue.
And what is the significance of Imran Khan being ousted from power in Pakistan? Is that potentially signalling a Pakistan once again riddled with instability, where you've got the big powers of the military and the intelligence services who essentially behind the scenes run that country and have been known historically to be very sympathetic towards the Taliban, in some instances harbouring them. Of course, Osama bin Laden was finally found on his compound in Taliban, and it was believed that a lot of people in the intelligence agencies in Pakistan knew full well where he was.
Look, the Pakistanis have played a double-handed game for the last 2 decades on this, and longer, in fact. Imran Khan, if you look at his statements, was very anti-Western and very pro-Taliban. That didn't stop him being removed because he'd gone against the power of the army, essentially, and the intelligence services in particular, within Pakistan. They will play their own game. The reality is we should be aware that they are not trustworthy allies, that they are playing their own game constantly, and their game frequently differs from ours in terms of the goals of trying to crack down on this radical form of religion as opposed to fostering it, which is in their interests.
In terms of domestic terrorism, bringing it back home, where poses or who poses the biggest threat to us right now? When we look at things through the prism of Islamist terrorism, is it in a network of mosques? Is it radicalised hate preachers? Is it in the prison system? Is it all of it?
Well, it's all of it in the sense, because if you look at the watch list, which is the sort of 43,000 people MI5 have on their kind of list, that doesn't mean they're watched the whole time, but they're the people they think are most likely to cause a terrorist attack. Those people are a mix of the things that you've identified. Some were radicalised in prison, some were radicalised in religious institutions, some were radicalised online. Others, of course, are people they didn't even know about, not on the list, people who will suddenly appear and cause a problem. However, it is worth remembering, most of the people who've been responsible for at least jihadist attacks over the past decade were known to the authorities in some way, shape or form and weren't followed up properly, which, to link it back to what you were saying at the start, is why the prevent review is so desperately needed. Right now, there are offenders or potential offenders who are being scrutinised, being allowed to go free, and who then commit terrorist attacks maybe years down the line, but they were known and it wasn't dealt with. So the key is, can we get a counter-extremism policy, counter-terrorism policy in place that really works now?
In terms of reforming Prevent, there have been talks about perhaps taking powers away from local authorities, making it a more professionalised system. Would that be the right approach, or is it actually very important to engage society at all levels in order to make sure that the Prevent system actually has the broadest possible reach?
Well, you need referrals, obviously. You need people who are around there in civil society to say, actually, I've seen X behaving a little suspiciously. I'm worried about it. Why? You know, I don't know what's happened to them in the last few months. Something's gone wrong there. You need that to come up, of course. Professionals aren't going to be able to find that kind of information. But then to act on it, you've got to have national security professionals, dispassionate people who are not going to be, if you like, politically biased one way or the other, thinking about, oh, let's look at a certain group, let's push those people up the chain into the channel programme, let's not put the other group in. The suspicion has been that because of the strange way that the referrals to Prevent work, when historically, apart from last year, the majority has always been radical Muslims going into that, but then in channel you end up with a majority of far-right people going through rather than radical Muslims, you then end up with a situation, well, how did that happen? And when you end up at the MI5 watch list stage, about 90% of them are radical Muslims. So clearly something's not right in the way the process is working. And somewhere there's been a disconnect. Now, my view is let the national security professionals decide who to put up, who not to put up, because that gets you away from local parochial agendas.
In that sense, do you think the system's been somewhat politicised?
Yes, very much so. I think we've been fed a diet for the last 5 years of news channels, not on GB News, of course, which tells the truth, but on many other news channels where we're told repeatedly the far right are the biggest threat to, you know, in the UK. They go fastest growing, sometimes biggest. It's not true. They might be the fastest growing, but they're starting from a very small base. We don't want it to increase, of course, but the absolute numbers remain as a terrorist threat from the jihadist element. And we're not being told that clearly and loudly in the way that other media organisations want us to hear.
Alan, thank you. I really want to know